The fire has settled now, its glow a low red pulse upon the hearth. Wax drips slow as honey down the candle's spine, and the scent of lavender lingers, mingled with the sharper perfume of old paper. Beyond these walls the city beats on, but here, in this room, the world has narrowed to the hush of breath, the click of needles, and the rustle of a turning page. You have not left, my starling. You remain, a still shape in the shadowed parlour, eyes bright, lips parted as though to catch each word before it falls. The hour has deepened. Night itself seems to lean in close. Together we sit, waiting, as the ink-dark stories coil tighter around us. We have already tasted the first morsel of this dreadful. Now comes the second course, darker, richer, more perilous. Threads of deceit, hunger and whispered oaths wind closer to the throat. Keep your seat, my starling. Hold the candle steady. For tonight, again, we descend into the string of pearls. And the next chapter waits with its blade behind its back. Morning came late to London, as it often did, a dimness rather than a light. The fog that had pressed its face to Fleet Street through the night now softened its grip, smearing coach wheels and boot heels into one slow-moving smear. Printers shouted headlines no one could quite read until they were nosed to paper. Clerks clutched bundles of writs like infants and elbowed one another with the politeness of wolves. Yet it was not Fleet Street proper that held the city's appetite this morning. Appetite had chosen a side alley. Bellyard looked, at first glance, like any other narrow throat cut between buildings. Stone slicked with old rain, windows peering down with the meanness of tired eyes. But halfway along it, set a little proud of the line of shop fronts, stood a modest establishment with a varnished door and a shining brass handle, both polished to a nicety that suggested prosperity had made sudden, affectionate advances. The sign above said simply, Mrs. Lovett's Pies. The door opened and closed in a happy stutter, customers in, customers out, until the bell above it sounded like laughter. Warmth spilled over the threshold, followed by a smell that turned heads even in the street. Pastry, hot and short. A sweetness that was not quite sweet. Pepper daring the tongue from across a room. Men who had meant only to pass were captured by it, lured as neatly as fish by a glimmer. Office boys put down their bundles and picked up pies. Barristers in wigs, careful not to blot their dignity with gravy, queued behind errand lads and costermongers. Behind the counter moved Mrs. Lovett herself, a woman not so young as to duck-yield the eye, nor so old as to be excused from the business of pleasing it. She was handsome in a London way, that is, with colour that suggested health and calculation in equal measure, and with a smile that travelled where the coins did. She had quick hands, quicker words, and the kind of memory that can tally 6 orders while correcting a 7th change. Trays came up from below with mechanical regularity, as if the floor had learned to eat and breathe. A hatch at the back opened and closed with a soft thump, and steam, honest steam, he would have sworn, rolled from it in white sighs. Mrs. Lovett moved through the vapour like a queen whose crown was always exactly where she had left it. "Next!" And don't be shy of the gravy, love. It's put there to be spooned. If there was a question in any face about how so many pies so perfectly uniform could be produced so quickly and so early, it did not make the effort of becoming a voice. London prefers not to interrogate pleasure. It eats, pays, and blesses the cook. Beneath the shop, though, where pleasure is manufactured and questions are not invited, the air changed its mind about honesty. The bakehouse was a red-lit cavern whose bricks sweated and whose rafters collected the breath of ovens. Heat hammered the senses until thought wrinkled like paper in a flame. On a long table, pale hills of dough rose and subsided, like dreams remembering themselves. Between them, a boy worked with a precision that belonged more to survival than to art. He could have been 16. Flour dusted his hair and lashes until he seemed frost-touched, while sweat cut clean tracks down his face. His hands were clever because they had to be. His back bent because no one asked it to straighten. When he paused, steam explained what would happen to someone who paused too long. "Mind the pepper," came a voice from the stair, Mrs. Lovett's voice, flattened by dissent. "Not a dram more than the measure, or men will cough honesty into their sleeves." Quickly now. "Yes, ma'am," the boy answered, because there are spells in the world, and one of them is called "Yes, ma'am." He tipped pepper from a tin, measured by habit and fear, and stirred it into a tray of minced meat, whose surface shivered as if it remembered being more than surface. A dumbwaiter clacked to attention at his elbow, its ropes trembling, its box yawning like a polite mouth. He loaded tins. It swallowed. It climbed toward the ceiling with an appetite he envied. "Your cheeks," Mrs. Lovett observed as she reached the last step, "look rosy enough to sell." She crossed to the table and pressed a finger to the pastry lids, cooling in ranks as neat as soldiers on review. Lovely. A touch more glaze. We are not savages. "No, ma'am," the boy said again. He kept his eyes on his work because the other place to put them, the lidded tubs by the wall, had its own gravity. Something about their quietness suggested secrets. He had once tilted a lid a thumb's width, just to breathe a different air, and what came out had not been air. He did not repeat the experiment. "Raise the next," she said, and he obeyed. The dumbwaiter descended as if from a height of reason, and waited for him to decide what the next thing should be. He chose pastry. He always chose pastry. Meat he chose only when told to, because told to meat is easier to touch than meat you have to name. Upstairs the bell rang and rang. "Another dozen to chambers," someone called down, "and the clerk says to pack them tight, as if pies could offend one another." "Men are impossible when they are hungry," Mrs. Lovett said with a smile that had never met impossibility it couldn't invoice. She swept back up the stair, light as a woman with no weight upon her conscience. When she was gone, the boy paused with his hands in the dough and let a sound escape him that was not quite a word. It made a shape in the hot air and lived a moment before the ovens burned it. A whisper returned through a vent low in the brickwork. No language, only intention. Work or sleep forever. He did not know whether the vent ever belonged to a voice or whether the heat itself learned to threaten, but he accepted the wisdom as a man accepts gravity. Back in Fleet Street proper, Joanna Oakley wrapped a shawl about her shoulders and tried the morning by another window. Their lodging was over the shop and faced the world at a kinder height. She had slept little. Anxiety writes sentences on the eyelids that no dream can erase. Her father set a cup by her hand and said nothing, because kindness sometimes means saying nothing. "Do you smell it?" she asked. "I do," said her father. "It makes me ill," she said, and could not have told you why. By habit, her gaze found the crooked barber's pole and stayed there long enough to hear it creak in her mind. A figure passed the dim window behind the pole, a pale movement, perhaps only a man crossing his own floor. She felt a small tightening in her throat, the way a string feels when a violinist prepares to pluck it. That same morning, Colonel Geoffrey called, looking more tired than a soldier on furlough ought to look. His arm, which habitually sought the comfort of a sword, now adjusted itself to civilian life with visible reluctance. "Miss Oakley," he said, bowing, "I am told Belliard's pies constitute a public improvement." "Then London is easily improved," she replied, and her attempt at lightness betrayed her. He saw it and said gently, "We will make inquiries." A man cannot disappear and call it his own choice without leaving us some trace of reluctance. Mark was not a man to turn willingly from his word. He walked with her as far as the yard, more to measure the place than to covet its produce. The queue made a street where there was not one. A law clerk, coming out with a tin under his arm, declared life too short for bad pastry, and swept past with a cheerfulness that ought to have been suspicious on its own. Geoffrey watched the hatch breathe, trays rising full and returning empty, and felt the particular unease that soldiers feel when confronted not with battle, but with logistics done too well. "Extraordinary supply," he said. "And constant demand," Johanna answered. "London never tires of eating." "Or of not asking," he murmured. When they parted, she did not go home at once. She stood in an eddy of the crowd, as stationary as a stone in a stream, and listened as men bit into pies and made the agreeable noises of the well-fed. The sound went through her oddly, as if somewhere a bell had rung a wrong note. She pressed a hand against her middle and thought of pearls, white, cool, strung, and of a chair that creaked in a room she had never seen. Below, the dumb waiter clacked again. The boy reached for a fresh tin and, by chance or curse, dragged his knuckles across a smear upon the table that was not gravy. He wiped it on his apron quickly, like a child wiping a mistake from a slate. Then he reached to lift the next lid. He did not. He stepped back instead, and took 3 breaths in a row, which is sometimes a prayer. At noon the alley grew rowdier, as though the city's appetite kept a clock. Mrs. Lovett, who could have balanced a ledger while waltzing, rode the hour like a tide. 12 for chambers, no, 14, and a half-dozen for the copying clerks who swear starvation is the cause of their errors. Her laughter had a bright, tinny ring that carried even over the clatter of plates. From time to time she dipped below, not so much to labour as to remind labour that it belonged to her. The boy watched her shoes on the stair, clean, neat, untouched by flour, and felt something like gratitude that shoes could be so certain of themselves. He turned dough, sealed lids with a wet thumb, crimped edges, and slid the trays into the dumbwaiter's wooden maw. The oven doors, when opened, exhaled heat like a confession. When closed, they held their tongues. He had learned to separate the day into safe thoughts and unsafe. Safe thoughts: measure, fold, pepper, glaze, tray up, bell rings, coins clink. Unsafe thoughts: what meat weighed so heavily in the tubs? Why sometimes a strap on a tub came up sticky? Why, when he dreamed, faces pressed out of pastry at him, hot and pale and terribly polite? Safe thoughts were quicker. Mrs. Lovett drifted close to him now, inspecting. "You are precise," she said, and the boy's shoulders untensed a fraction. "Precision makes fortune." "No, ma'am." "Good," she said, and patted a pastry as one might a sleeping cat. "Questions are like mice. Let one in and they breed." Upstairs, Colonel Geoffrey made a small experiment. He purchased a single pie. For science, he told himself with a grimness that had nothing to do with pastry, and took it to the mouth of the yard. There he broke it with his spoon, not eating so much as inquiring. What could be seen was ordinary: meat minced fine, jelly set with a professional hand, herbs and pepper used with care. "This is speculation," he said aloud, as if to rebuke himself. He pressed the lid back into the tin and handed it to a beggar with a coin. "Eat, friend. Forgive the experiment." "Bless you, sir," the man said, and ate with the gratitude of one who has stopped believing in luck but finds himself wrong for a minute. Geoffrey returned to Johanna with the look of a man who has peered into a room through a keyhole and found the key lodged in his throat. "The trade is too perfect," he said. "Perfection in London is never innocent." "Then it is guilty," Johanna answered simply. There was no drama in her voice, only a steadiness that frightened him more than any outcry would have done. What do we do with guilt when it bakes itself so handsomely? "We watch until it makes a mistake," he said, "and we help it along if we can." They kept to opposite pavements and let the day turn its own pages. Twice, a small cart nudged out of the lane behind Sweeney Todd's shop and took the long way toward Bell Yard, its driver a man with a blank, tidy face. The cart did not hurry. Guilt seldom does. Johanna noticed the way the driver's shoulders squared when the cart jolted, as if jolts could reveal something he'd rather not hear knocking. Geoffrey noticed the way the cart returned sooner than its weight suggested it should. In the bakehouse, the boy worked himself light-headed. Somewhere behind the wall, a voice, whether human or a trick of the vent he could never swear, repeated its lesson: work or sleep forever. He kneaded with the submission of a boy who has been taught that every alternative is a trap disguised as a door. Once, only once, he lifted a lid wider than was prudent. Steam slapped his face. Beneath, the meat lay in a uniform hush. But there, pressed half into jelly, was a small, unimportant-looking thing. A thread end? No, too bright. He fumbled it, and it skittered away into shadow. He shut the lid with a gasp as footsteps beat the stair. Mrs. Lovett, arriving, found him flush-cheeked and clumsy. "What have you broken?" Nothing, ma'am. Then fix it, she said, and her voice carried no more weight than a pin, though it pinned him just the same. The afternoon took on the anxious cheer of London workdays, the cheer that says, if we keep moving, nothing terrible can catch us. Lawyers argued through mouthfuls. Messengers trotted tin in hand. 2 apprentices ended a fistfight by agreeing that Mrs. Lovett's pies were the one true religion. At one point, a hymn-seller, smelling opportunity even in sacrilege, tried to hawk devotional tracts near the door and was gently relocated by a porter who believed in profit. That was when the pearl first glinted, though not to public eyes. A gentleman of regular habit, brisk and affable, ordered his dozen as usual and, as usual, added one for the errand boy who had waited. Mrs. Lovett's knife went neat as a syllable through the top crust of the gratuity pie, so the lad might eat without scalding his mouth. The blade encountered resistance, a small, hard click that did not belong to bone. It caught not like gristle, but like glass. Mrs. Lovett stopped. It was not the stop of a woman alarmed. It was the stop of a woman balancing a column that has added itself to the wrong side of a page. Her eyes did not widen. They narrowed, as if to focus through steam upon a tiny, inconvenient star in close orbit. With her free hand she lifted the lid. No one at the counter noticed. The yard is full of men who have forgotten the art of noticing anything but their hunger. Inside, against the jelly, something white and perfectly smooth shone with an immodest little light. Mrs. Lovett touched it with the tip of her knife and brought it out into the air, where only a person standing exactly where she stood could have seen it. Round, luminous, patient. A pearl. She did not breathe for the length of a heartbeat. Then, with the speed of a woman who keeps her accounts inside her skin, she slipped the thing to her palm and then to her pocket, as if nothing had occurred. She cut the pie into quarters. "Mind your tongue, lad. The gravy's brave today." And the boy began to eat, innocent of adornment. When the customer had gone, she turned her head very slightly toward the stair that led to the bakehouse, as if a draught there had spoken her name. She went down slower than usual, which for her was still swift. The heat crowded her at once, and with it the boy's fear, which was always there like a salt hung in the air. She said nothing at first. She set her hand upon the dumbwaiter's frame and felt the tremor of ropes that never quite rest. Then she drew the pearl from her pocket and held it up to the oven light. The thing made its own moon. The boy, startled by the whiteness between her fingers, blinked. "What?" "Curiosity," she said pleasantly, "has been the ruin of better boys than you. Return yourself to your pastry." He obeyed, but the pearl stayed behind his eyes, a spot of brightness that followed wherever he looked. She, for her part, weighed it as if it might tell its own value in a whisper. Pearls, she knew, were the sort of creatures that rarely travel alone. If one had found its way into a pie, it had not done so of its own will. The arithmetic began to write itself in her head: barber, chair, barrels, ovens, appetite, coin, and the cycle looked so elegant that it seemed almost a hymn. The ovens breathed around her like living bellows, and the boy's hands, pale and quick, moved faster because hands that paused invited suspicion. At the top of the stair, the bell clamoured for more. At the bottom, the dumbwaiter rattled like a throat that never cleared. Mrs. Lovett closed her fist on the pearl until its edge pressed into the soft of her palm. The pain was a kind of anchor, a reminder that profit and peril often walked arm in arm. She dropped the jewel into a small tin that had once held cloves and now held only secrets, snapping the lid shut as though to dismiss doubt. She returned upstairs. The bell above the door greeted her like a faithful servant, and she smiled her practiced smile at two jurymen arguing the season of mercy. "Gentlemen," she said, voice bright, "pepper is the only mercy worth trusting." They laughed, and she laughed with them, though her eyes were elsewhere. Laughter has teeth, but none of them noticed. Across Fleet Street, Joanna Oakley drew back from the door, her stomach twisting. The smell of pastry clung even to the fog, but to her it was sickness. She pressed her hand to the wood and whispered, "I will find you." London, deaf as ever when truth was spoken softly, did not answer. Below, the boy slid another tray into the dumbwaiter. His mind, though he tried to forbid it, wandered to the treasure. He imagined a girl who wore pearls for their sound rather than their cost, who turned her head and heard them click gently together. He imagined that girl crying, and his throat tightened. He returned to his work, but the thought stayed lodged like grit beneath a lid. Mrs. Lovett's knife lifted over a fresh pie. As the blade slid in, her hand anticipated resistance. Not gristle, but something else. It struck, small, stubborn, bright. She paused, her mouth quirking into a brief, private smile. Another. Always another. Evening lowered itself over London without ceremony. The sky darkened to bruised violet, then black. Bell Yard, lively all day, softened by degrees. Clerks scurried toward supper. Apprentices licked the last of their gravy, and Mrs. Lovett at last pulled the door to, leaving behind a city fed and content. But the ovens beneath did not rest. They hissed and whispered, like animals uneasy in their sleep. The boy slumped at his bench, his sleeves sticky with dough, his arms heavy with fatigue. When the stair creaked, he flinched, listening. She descended, but not with orders or trays or laughter. This time she carried only herself, and the kind of calm that frightened more than a raised hand. "You worked well today," she said, as though placing a coin in his palm. "Yes, ma'am." His voice cracked. "And yet," she continued, "prosperity has its inconveniences. For example," she snapped open her tin, and there upon her palm glowed the pearl. Its cold fire made the lamplight seem false. The boy's throat closed. "Do you know what this is?" "A bead, ma'am?" Her smile thinned. "A bead, yes, if you choose to call it that. But beads do not wander into pies on their own. They need a path. And paths," she leaned closer, "have beginnings." She snapped the tin shut. The boy flinched at the sound. "You will forget it," she said softly. "Forget what you saw. Forget what I said, or the ovens will answer for me. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good. She turned away, her skirts whispering against the stone. But his fist clenched in his lap, hiding what she had not seen. Another pearl, pale and accusing, stolen from the dumbwaiter's edge. Above, the bell rang once more. A gentleman bit into his pie, stopped, and drew from his mouth a hard, shining sphere. He held it aloft. "What's this?" he asked. The pearl gleamed in the lamplight, and for the first time in Bell Yard, the laughter faltered.